Um, Hello, friends. My name is John Choe. I am a member of Flushing Meeting, which is located in Queens, New York, part of New York Elite Meeting. And I wear several hats. I'm also the current president of the Flushing Interfaith Council, which is a coalition of different churches, synagogues, mosques, various houses of worship in our community that provides a lot of education and solidarity work. And then lastly, I'm also the executive director of the Greater Flushing Chamber of Commerce, which is a nonprofit organization that helps our community with, again, education, advocacy, and networking programs. And just a little bit about my background before I get into my slideshow and Q&A. I was born in Korea, and my family migrated to Australia. I lived there for about a decade before I came to New York with my family and went to high school and college here. I received a degree in history at Binghamton University and a master's in public policy. My background is in government and politics and public service. And when I came back from school, I worked with a number of community organizations, including the Committee Against Anti-Asian Violence, as well as a new group that I helped to form called Norato for Korean Community Development. And we worked on many different issues around immigrant rights and also making sure that we promoted peace in the Korean Peninsula. So that was a lot of my work up to the 1990s. And in 1996, our local councilwoman, Julia Harrison, told the New York Times that the Asian immigrants moving into her district were essentially robbers and thieves, and that we came to conquer and invade the neighborhood. And as you can imagine, many people were very upset about those remarks by an elected official, basically scapegoating her own constituents for many of the problems that were taking place in Flushing, Queens at that time, including overdevelopment, poor sanitation, and other issues regarding traffic congestion, quality of life issues, etc. I helped to organize demonstrations, rallies, and protests, and demanded her resignation, but she did not resign. In fact, she won re-election at the next election with the support of the local Democratic Party. I reconnected with people from college and ended up working with one of my classmates, John Liu, who entered city government as the first elected official in New York. This was in 2001, representing Flushing, Queens, taking over the position that Julia Harrison vacated with term limits. And I became his legislative director. We enacted a series of reforms, including the first language access bill, which basically mandates that all city agencies, especially those focused on health and human services, provide programs in different languages. Up until that point, if you were sick or if you had serious health problems, and you didn't speak English, you basically were not served, and you didn't have full access to all the resources that New York residents had at that time. And so we were able to push through these landmark bills, and really, in my view, made a big difference for immigrants, for new Americans who were moving into Queens and other places in New York City. After that experience, I worked with John Liu when he was elected to the city comptroller office, which is the top fiscal officer of the city, right below the mayor, and worked on several projects that included looking at gender pay disparities in city municipal workforce, looking at community development policies around housing and building development in different neighborhoods and community benefits for those projects. But I really wanted to go back to Flushing, and so I ended up returning to Flushing, Queens, establishing the Greater Flushing Chamber of Commerce, and really advocated on behalf of immigrant entrepreneurs and small business owners, many of whom had no information on how to access city services. Many of them were, even though many of them had helped to revive Flushing. You know, I don't know if any of you have visited Flushing, but in the 70s and 80s, we had a huge flight of white people from New York City into the suburbs, and Flushing was one of those neighborhoods that fell into disrepair. We had vacant storefronts, rising crime, a lot of problems with many middle-class families abandoning our neighborhood. And so what many people feel saved Flushing was the influx of immigrants who reestablished businesses and start to have families, start to send their children to local schools, and really changing the fabric of New York City, not just in Flushing, but throughout New York City in the 2000s. You know, New York City, despite all of the problems that we've faced, isn't Detroit. You know, Detroit is a city that lost 1 million residents, and their government was bankrupt at a certain point. New York City actually gained 1 million residents and was able to continue to provide services for our residents. I would say because of the labor and taxes that were generated through immigrants coming into New York City. And so I felt, as someone who is a community organizer, that the city had to really support neighborhoods like Flushing, that we were not on the margins of New York City economic life, but we're actually central to making cities like New York more resilient and more sustainable, because one of the problems with New York City over the many decades is that we have become very reliant on Wall Street, the financial sector, to prop up our economy. And so whenever we have a national recession, New York City's tax revenue goes into a die of, and we have to cut hundreds of thousands of employees. We have to cut school programs and social services and health programs. And I argue that it's because of the influx of immigrants that New York City has been able to overcome these challenges and continue to prosper as a city. And but unfortunately, the government has not really recognized that. And so a lot of the programs and tax subsidies still go to large corporations. I don't know if you remember a couple of years ago, New York City and New York State were going to provide more than $3 billion of tax subsidy programs to Amazon to locate their headquarters in Queens. And I was one of the people who was opposed to that, not only because Amazon never needed that money to relocate to New York City, but our government has never provided $3 billion of anything like that to small businesses or immigrant entrepreneurs or any of the programs and services that we need in neighborhoods like Flushing. When Mayor Bloomberg was in City Hall, he actually used $2 billion of city capital funds to extend the 7 train, which is one of the main subway lines to Flushing, but not on the Flushing side. He extended it in Manhattan into Hudson Yards, which was basically an empty development zone that was being provided to super wealthy developers to build luxury condos and commercial spaces. And so, again, it's just another example of city governments really not acknowledging the role of immigrants and basically providing an unequal and inequitable distribution of resources. And so, again, Mayor Bloomberg or any of his successors have never contributed $2 billion of city capital funds to support transportation infrastructure on the other side of the 7 train in Flushing, Queens, where there's actually a growing, thriving community that actually has needs. So that's been the focus of my work over the past couple of years. And I wanted to show you some photographs of how the pandemic has impacted Flushing and what we have been doing during the pandemic. And so it's not a long slideshow, but I just wanted to give you some context for what's going on in Flushing, Queens. So let me see if I can share. Hold on. All right, so can everyone see those slides? I'm going to assume that you can. All right, so let's see. Very early on during the pandemic, again, I don't know if anyone remembers, but there was a huge wave of fear, especially in the media. And so you had the New York Post, the New York Times, many of the mainstream media outlets saying that this was an Asian disease, that to watch out for Chinese people because they had the disease and they were spreading it, even though that was not true. In fact, the first reported cases of COVID actually came through Europe. But it had a devastating impact on our small businesses in Flushing because many of our businesses and our community is predominantly immigrant and Chinese. And so we actually tried to support local businesses by having meetups and meals at some of the local restaurants. For example, this is one at a local food court on Main Street and Roosevelt in downtown Flushing. In March, I worked with an organization called La Jornada, which set up a food pantry and started to distribute food to people who were growing hungry because there was actually a lockdown in New York City, and you couldn't get food from supermarkets or grocery stores or restaurants because they were all closed. And so we started off feeding, I think, about 4,000 families, which doubled to 8,000 families and eventually to 10,000 families every week. Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and then eventually every day of the week, except Sunday. I also worked with other organizations to deliver food to senior citizens and immunocompromised individuals who couldn't even leave their homes to go to food pantries. This is something that the city did not provide in terms of immediate assistance right after the lockdown was established. The city did eventually provide deliveries, but it took several months for that to happen. This is just a photograph of the line at the food pantry. You can't see the line outside of this photograph, but it goes on for several blocks. It goes on for like 5 city blocks in downtown Flushing. So here you see people in the middle of winter basically waiting for hours in very cold weather to get this food. So this is the line on Main Street. I worked with many of the restaurant owners to promote, again, the fact that Flushing needs support, that the businesses need customers to survive. Flushing, Queens, even though we have one of the highest concentrations of small businesses in New York, didn't receive a lot of PPP loans and other federal assistance during this period, which I think it's a testimony to the fact that the federal government didn't really know how to support diverse communities in cities like New York, that many of their initial loans and grants were to actually very large corporations who were abusing the system. At this time, we also continue to have rallies in support of Black Lives Matter. I don't remember the exact chronology, but during this time, George Floyd was murdered, and we felt that as an immigrant Asian American community, we needed to stand up with our African American brothers and sisters and say that the way they were being treated was simply unjust and unacceptable. We did a lot of promotional campaigns and marketing to support the small business rebuild, but I think the amount of resources that we had was very limited, and many businesses actually ended up closing. I know one restaurant owner, her landlord forced her to pay rent throughout this period, even though she was inside an interior mall, which was closed to the public. And so even though no one could actually access her restaurant, she was still forced to pay rent and eventually had to close her business. It's another business that we helped support. We did a lot of surveys, including a campaign to improve bus service. This was, again, difficult to do during the middle of a pandemic, but we were actually successful in getting city government to establish a busway. I don't know if you have been to New York City, but public transit is a critical part of our economy. The frontline workers working at restaurants and supermarkets, in local schools and hospitals, the only way they could get to work, many of them working class people, was to use public transit, and yet the city didn't provide enough infrastructure and service to support those workers. And so we actually ended up establishing a busway, which really made the buses much more reliable in downtown Flushing, and the streets safer. I believe there was almost a 50% decline after the busway was established of traffic fatalities and crashes on Main Street. This is another Black Lives Matter rally. We're actually counter-protesting another group that you can't really see that was supporting police officers, and their chant was Blue Lives Matter. And I think many of you can see the problem with trying to foreground the lives of police officers when many of them were not taking into consideration the lives of the people there was sworn to protect. We also continue to support green markets. This is one market that we opened with Grow NYC. It was one of the few open air markets, and so during the lockdown, it was critical for people who needed to get fresh fruits and vegetables from local farmers. We continue to give out food. This is food that was prepared by local restaurants and subsidized by a number of different charities that we worked with. We also, at the Green Market, started art exhibits and cultural programs, because not only were supermarkets and restaurants closed, but museums and cultural institutions were closed at the same time. And so we wanted to make sure that people still had connections to local artists and cultural activities during the lockdown. This is another campaign that I participated in. During the pandemic, the city tried to push through a development project called the Special Flushing Waterfront District, which would have established more than 1,000 units of luxury condominiums, hotels, and malls. We felt that actually what the community needed was affordable housing. The developers ended up providing or promising to build, I believe it was 60 units of affordable housing, which is clearly not enough to serve our community. In two previous rounds of affordable housing developments, one was called Macedonia Plaza, which had 141 units of affordable housing. Almost 40,000 applications were received for that lottery to get 141 units of housing in that project. The second project, a couple of years later, I believe had about 200 units, and they received almost 80,000 applications for those 200 plus units at one Flushing. So the demand for affordable housing is clear, and the city really did a disservice to our community by trying to push through this luxury development project in the middle of a pandemic. People couldn't even go to City Hall to testify. People were not aware of what the city was doing in this matter. I can go on about this, but unfortunately, despite our efforts, this project was approved. This is another photograph of another protest that we organized. This is one of the housing organizers I work with, talking about how developers and large financial corporations are buying apartment buildings in downtown Flushing and basically harassing and evicting the renters there so they could jack up the rents. This is a practice that is very prevalent in Flushing, but happens throughout the city. And it was happening during the pandemic. Even though at one point there was a moratorium on evictions, the average rent in New York City is now about $3,500. And for a working class family, there's no way they can afford that. We continue to do cultural programming, including different celebrations of Korean and Chinese harvest festivals. This is one for the Korean community. This is a image of one of the luxury developments in Flushing. These renderings by developers, they look very beautiful and very clean, but what they hide is the fact that most of these developments are unaffordable. These apartment units go for $1 million or more, and at least half of these units are not even occupied, they're vacant. Many of them are used for investment purposes. Many of the owners are actually living overseas. So even though the city is supporting this type of development, it's not actually supporting local residents in New York City. This is a gentleman who was found in a cardboard box sleeping and who had passed away overnight. He was an elderly Asian American immigrant, and like many immigrant workers, had lost their jobs and any ability to survive. You can tell he's Asian because he took off his shoes and placed them outside the box. But we don't know how many people died during the pandemic because they lost housing or income. But this is something that I think is just morally wrong for the richest city in the richest country in the world to allow senior citizens to basically die alone on a public street like this in New York City. This is a photograph of the food pantry where we would cook food for volunteers. These are former restaurant workers living under a bridge. I had participated in an outreach to the workers during Christmas. We provided food and backpacks with clothing and sleeping bags. A lot of attention has been put to business owners and restaurant owners, but very little attention has been placed on the workers, especially immigrant workers. These are the people who, if you go to a restaurant, are working in the kitchen, cleaning your tables and making the food that you eat. And yet we cannot take care of them when things fall apart. It's really an indictment on this country that we can't take care of workers. And that's it. So I just wanted to give you a sense of what we did during the pandemic, and maybe I could take some questions and talk about what we're doing now. But I wanted to just give you a sense of what happened in neighborhoods like Flushing, Queens these past 3 years.
How similar is Flushing to other neighborhoods in, especially Queens and Brooklyn and the Bronx? Is that a similar story for many of those areas?
Yeah. So one thing about Flushing is that in many ways it's kind of the canary in the coal mine. Flushing has really developed much more, much faster, and has been much more diverse in its population demographics than other communities. And I can go into the whole history. It's a long conversation, but I would say that other neighborhoods are catching up to the diversity of Flushing. New York City, as I mentioned before, couldn't have survived without immigrants moving in. And so many neighborhoods throughout the city are starting to or have faced many of the challenges that I've mentioned. Our commercial district in downtown Flushing has rents that are higher than in Midtown Manhattan. And for a lot of people, they just don't understand how that's possible because and all of the resources, like I said before, they go to these major corporations that have headquarters in Manhattan. We're just a rinky-dink little neighborhood in Queens at the end of the 7 train. But we actually generate, the small businesses generate, more than $1.5 billion of sales every year. We have 40 plus bank branches. We're one of the largest financial centers in the entire country. We have an enormous entrepreneurial activity, not just locally, but tied to international trade. And so, again, while what's going on in Flushing is certainly unique in some ways, I don't think, I think it's something that other neighborhoods are starting to face, this type of development where you have neighborhoods that are not necessarily tied to Manhattan, but are tied to, trade with Taiwan or South Korea or Vietnam, and where, people are not necessarily speaking Yiddish or come from Ireland or, have a German background, but are coming from Latin America and Asia primarily.
Yeah, I always loved going to Flushing. It's got its own airport, LaGuardia, and of course the World Fair was in Flushing. So I mean, if you look on a map and you see where it is, it's also the other Chinatown too. I mean, there's Chinatown in Manhattan, but Flushing's also known as the second Chinatown. So it's a very, very interesting place. And that's where George Fox went to preach. And just around the corner from Flushing Meeting is a big tree that, the tree's gone, but there's a plaque and a tree trunk showing where George Fox preached that turned Flushing into a hotbed of Quakerism. I mean, from what I see, Arch Street Meeting in Philadelphia is certainly where Quakers started in Philadelphia, but Flushing is certainly Flushing came before that, and Quakers started in Flushing before Philadelphia. You saw one of John's T-shirts. It had Flushing established 1645. That's very cool. Yeah.
Susanna, I got cut off for a couple of minutes. Did you have a question?
No, I was just talking about Flushing.
Okay.
The geography of it, and the World's Fair, LaGuardia. Just to get an idea of what's around there. Yeah.
Tom, did you have a question?
Yes, I do. Does Flushing have its own unit of government, or does it depend on the Queen's government?
So Flushing, as Susanna mentioned, was established in 1645 by the Dutch. And it had its own government until 1900, when the city was consolidated, and Queens, Brooklyn, Manhattan, and the Bronx and Staten Island became one city.
I see.
We have a town hall, Flushing Town Hall, which was our seat of government. It's no longer a government office. It's a cultural institution. They have amazing performances. I would definitely recommend you going there, but we don't have our own government.
Does Queens have any form of local government since the consolidation?
So we have this institution called the Borough Presidents, which is a relic of the county executive position that used to exist before the consolidation. Actually, right up to the 1980s, the borough presidents had an enormous power because our city government was controlled by the Board of Estimate, where each of the borough presidents had a vote. Unfortunately for them, the Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional because it violated the one person, one vote principle. And so that form of city government was disbanded, and borough presidents no longer wield any significant power. They are mostly advisors on land use issues, for example. During the 1960s, the city tried to establish community boards. These are local neighborhood focused advisory councils. But again, they're mostly advisory and have no formal power. in city government. Our city government currently is a strong mayor system where the mayor is basically in control of city government in partnership with this 51-member city council.
So you're only Flushing's only redress is to city council and the mayor.
That's correct.
Okay.
And you know, a lot of people don't realize the scale of city government, but New York City spends every year about $100 billion in programs and services, which makes New York City the fourth largest jurisdiction outside of the US government, the state of California, the state of New York, and then it's the city of New York. It's just huge in terms of its economic and political power. Yes, Barbara?
Thank you very much, John. It was I really enjoyed your presentation. How do you and your volunteers how do you raise money for things like food pantry and the other kinds of things that you try and do for the indigent?
Sure. So first of all, the food pantry, we served about 10,000 people every week. And so we had people who were not necessarily poor, but who just didn't have access to food. Many of them were senior citizens with limited incomes. Many of them were working families who lost their jobs. Some of them were people who lost their housing. So it was a very broad sector of our community that needed food. These were not the traditional indigent population that you may be visualizing. These were people who were suffering during a global pandemic. And unfortunately, I have to say that my own congregation, Flushing Meeting, was not very forthcoming in terms of contributing funds to help the local food pantries. Through the Interfaith Council, we were able to get contributions from other congregations, including the Hindu temple here, the oldest Hindu temple in North America, as well as the Mormon Church, and many other religious organizations. But unfortunately, my own congregation did not contribute that much to the effort. We relied also on local businesses to contribute. Much of the hot food that was distributed was actually cooked by local restaurants. We would often raise money to support those restaurants, but that was actually difficult to do, was provide hot food. So the bulk of the food that we got was stuff that you would find in the grocery, canned foods, dry foods, vegetables. We had one vegetable wholesaler who donated a lot of the surplus food that he had every week. This was like thousands of tons of food. So many businesses were very generous in contributing and supporting our efforts. Unfortunately, government didn't step up until much later on, and again, this is on the scale of a natural disaster, and so you can't depend on houses of worship or local businesses to sustain this type of effort. But we really needed the local, state, and federal government to step in, and eventually they did. Although last year they actually closed the food pantry, and so there's actually a concern in downtown Flushing about whether people continue to have access to food, especially with increasing inflation and cost of living. As I mentioned, the rents in Flushing are extremely high, and so that is really a public need that needs to be addressed by governments long term.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. I actually just had a comment. You'd mentioned that COVID was not, even though it may have originated, it was first Europeans who kind of brought it. We did the same thing with, the quote unquote Spanish influenza. We know definitively now that it actually originated in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and
Right.
we thought it's, some other, people's problem, right? And then that typically is how we handle pandemics, it seems like in the U.S.
Yeah, and it's not just pandemics, but it seems like our society is susceptible to these waves of anxiety and fear campaigns. Right now, you have this rather xenophobic campaign against TikTok, a major social media platform, purely because it was developed in China and has Chinese government investments in that company. But yeah, I mean, if you look at the history of immigration to the United States, it is not one that we should be proud of. The United States was one of the only countries that created immigration laws entirely on race. For example, the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was actually a series of acts that existed for decades and only excluded Chinese people. We had other laws excluding people from Japan and other countries as well. We had laws that denied immigrants the ability to naturalize as citizens purely because of their race. We had laws in California and other states that denied people the ability to own land and to be able to testify in juries, including Asian Americans. So the history of immigration to the United States is not something that we can be very proud of, actually, even though immigrants have contributed so much to the development of this nation and continue to do so.
Yeah.
The late Ronald Takaki, his seminal book, was it a Different Mirror? It talks about all the different others that came to the U.S. and he goes on to describe all their amazing contributions to our society, and there's still that capital O other, right there. And it seems like we always have a few others. Right now it's something different than it has been 5 years ago, but there's always the other, and it's obviously not white men who are the other.
Yeah, and even though I'm critical of people like Donald Trump for leading a lot of these xenophobic efforts, racism and xenophobia against immigrants is a long history that preceded Donald Trump, and the right-wing movements that basically control our political system today. If you look at, for example, in Flushing, I mentioned that I initially got involved in politics because our local councilwoman was basically rehashing all of these yellow peril stereotypes to scapegoat her own constituents. She was defended by the Democratic Party that controls local politics here in Queens, and they continue to support some people like Julie Harrison. It took more than 300 years for an Asian American to be elected, and that was because so many Asian Americans were angry at what Julie Harrison had said and blamed us for. So we have still a long ways to go. There's actually a campaign right now that I'm involved with where Stephen Cohen, the owner of the New York Mets, I don't know if you guys follow baseball, but he owns the New York Mets. He's a multi-billionaire, the 94th wealthiest person in the entire world. He is proposing a casino right next to Citi Field, which is right next to Flushing. And he's presenting this proposal as a win-win for everyone because it's right next to Flushing, which is a ready market for gambling and gambling addiction. And he is relying on the same stereotypes that I had discussed earlier against Asian Americans and Chinese people specifically as carriers of vice, of gambling, prostitution, and saying, well, look, we already have a population that likes to gamble. They're going to benefit if we build a casino right next to Flushing. And I think it's a really despicable and offensive way of presenting this proposal for a casino in New York City. But he's getting away with it because no one really understands the history that he's relying on. Governor Kathy Hochul, who is the governor of New York, actually has a campaign to end menthol cigarettes, because many of you know cigarette companies specifically target African Americans and Latinos to sell menthol cigarettes. And so from a public policy perspective, you have the governor of New York wanting to ban menthol cigarettes. But when developers want to build a casino next to Flushing, an immigrant, predominantly Asian American Chinese neighborhood, no one blinks an eye. No one says anything because no one thinks that it's a problem to present a major development project on top of a stereotype of Chinese people. So this is something that's ongoing. As an Asian American, maybe I'm overly sensitive to these things, but I see it all the time, and it's hard to unsee. And I don't blame any particular party. This is part of the fabric of the United States. It's as deeply ingrained as slavery and racism and white supremacy.
I listened to part of the congressional hearing last week of that young man. He's from Singapore.
Right.
He's not. I mean, I couldn't believe that they were all going on about the Chinese government when he's from Singapore. I mean, if you know anything about Chinese from Singapore, they are not fans of the Republic of China. I mean, not at all, not even close. And also, he was educated in Britain and at Harvard. I mean, when did he get a chance to go and get indoctrinated in China? I mean, the whole thing makes no sense at all. And I thought that was incredible. He was so bullied. And he handled it with such grace. My gosh. It was just awful to watch.
I was watching a TikTok video about the congressional hearings, and the takeaway from that was the CEO of TikTok is basically a Republican Party wet dream because he's well educated, he's a capitalist, he controls a multi-million-dollar company.
Right, exactly.
You'd want to curry his favor,
right?
But because he happens to look Chinese, because he looks Asian, it's totally appropriate to sling all sorts of racist, dog whistle accusations about him being a puppet for the Chinese Communist Party.
It was just so incredibly absurd. It just so...
Some people said it was akin to the McCarthy hearings.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, I don't know if anyone knows this, but the McCarthy hearings started as an attack on peace activists who were opposing the Korean War. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, it was used to shut down the peace movement against the Korean War, and it was effective because no one remembers the peace movement against the Korean War.
Right. Boy. Yeah. So
I grew up thinking that the House American Activities Committee, as a ignorant child, that was a major element of Congress, and it had been since the founding. So that was at that time. It was like the only thing you heard about Congress was UAC.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't. Does everyone? I'm assuming has seen the Manchurian Candidate, the original Manchurian Candidate.
Oh, yeah.
I think that's a fascinating film because at one level, it's a liberal critique of this communist hysteria that was prevalent in Congress at that time. But at another level, it's a deeply racist caricature of Asian people. This idea that the Chinese Communist Party was brainwashing people to assassinate American leaders. Who comes up with that kind of stuff? It only makes sense in the context of the Yellow Peril and our long history of racism against Asian Americans.
Yeah. Lois and her husband, they were giving out yellow bands during the pandemic because there was so much, there was all this, they were having all kinds of problems, because Chinatown's right next to Arch Street, and the Chinese population was suffering very badly. So the idea was, it wasn't, it was a whistle. So if you were to see anything, any attack on anyone Asian, you were supposed to whistle. I don't know, did it work? I mean, did you see any, Lois?
I didn't see any in use, as in people blowing their whistles, but I did see people wearing them, and 2 boxes worth were picked up by visitors to Arch Street.
Yeah. I mean, it's a tiny little gesture, but, the fact that we were aware of it, I mean, it was just awful. Yeah. During that time.
Yeah, even now, Donald Trump still uses the phrase China virus, and
right.
it's really upsetting because many people have pointed out to him that that type of language only reinforces anti-Asian stereotypes and facilitates violence against Asians in our communities, and yet he continues to use it. We don't have a system of accountability in this country against people with power and money.
Yeah.
It's because we rely on 250-year-old documents written by really, really rich white men who owned slaves. And we hold to these principles, right? Like freedom of speech, like, right, like equity is no more, like, why is that not, our in our Constitution, right? It is the way it's designed to be. And if you're the other, you're the other. I'm Asian American. I have every benefit of white privilege. When I was younger, I looked much more Asian than I do now. My father was half Japanese, half German, and he was born right after the war. So my grandmother immigrated here when she met my grandfather. He was in the Air Force, and the amount of racism he got from both ends, like go home crowd, go home Jap. It was just an odd experience. But then watching my father become racist himself as he got older was a very, very weird experience for me, because how can you experience that, right? And for me, it just told me and reinforced me that the people you associate with, right, and your networks are going to be where you derive your ethics from. And Trump knows exactly what he's saying when he says those words. He knows it's goading people that he wants to goad, and he knows it's bringing people together that he wants to bring to his cause. And you're right. There's nothing in the way to stop this from happening, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that points to the systemic nature of white supremacy and racism in this country, that it's not about individuals per se, but it's about systems of control. We have a very large Asian American population, as I mentioned, in Flushing. Many of them are Trump supporters, and on one level, it doesn't make any sense because over the years, Trump has been very clear about his dismissal and underlying hatred of Asians, and his disrespect for the Chinese government and the Chinese people, and yet we have a growing number of Chinese immigrants in Flushing who support Donald Trump and his policies because it's almost like a hazing ritual in a fraternity where you go through this terrible trauma in order to have power to traumatize other people, and in the hierarchy of racism in this country, I think some Chinese people feel like, well, at least they're not African American or Latino, which is very clear. Like the people who support Trump see African Americans, Latinos as even more subhuman and less deserving of political rights than Asian Americans. And so some immigrants are latching on to the system of racism and racial hierarchy that was established for people. And it's not, Chinese Americans is not the first group to do that. When the Irish, when Italians, when Jewish people first moved to the United States, they were not considered white. They were treated as subhuman people who didn't deserve any rights or respect in this country. I think through the assimilation process, many of them took on the ideology of white supremacy and basically in return for their acceptance of that system, they became white. They took on the privileges of whiteness. And that's why you see people like Julia Harrison, an elected official with immigrant roots, saying the things she said about other immigrants, right? Her ancestors lived in the Lower East Side in Jewish and Italian and Irish neighborhoods, right? They face extreme levels of discrimination and inequities. And yet, now that they are elected officials and police officers and firefighters and teachers, they have power and privilege that they can traumatize other immigrants and other people of color. And so the cycle repeats itself. It's unless we find a way to intervene and stop institutional racism, it's a self-sustaining system.
It's all about communication. This is what Benjamin Franklin discovered, and he set up his own print shop in order to combat it. I had in-laws in Hazleton, and they were all coal miners, Polish coal miners, and this was in the 1980s, and they were absolutely all for Reagan, all for this right-wing stuff. I mean, they didn't have Fox News then, but they had other things. And these people who were absolutely genetically Democrat, they were all Republican. They were all voting for this right stuff. And then also too, the Ibu Catholic Church in West Philadelphia that I used to go to, they were all pro-Trump. They were all Nigerian, black, but they were Catholic, and they just they were absolutely all pro, and that was in Pennsylvania. So that they're the people that handed over the presidency to Trump.
Wow.
Yeah,
I think Hillary did that on her own by not even trying to look at the Midwest at all. But yeah, I do hear you.
That might be, but the fact that people vote against their own interests, this is what John's saying, and it makes no sense at all. But it's but it's widespread.
From a psychological stance, it kind of does make sense. And I've had a lot of black and brown friends who voted for Trump, but who supported Bernie until Hillary won. And for them, it was, they just didn't want status quo anymore. And so they wanted something different. They didn't want the same talking heads. And I can understand that to some degree, but for me, it's no coincidence that we're the only advanced nation that only mandates 2 political parties. Every other advanced nation has at least 3. So we have this false sense of dichotomy and polarization where, people accuse someone like Joe Biden of being a communist, right? When he's right of center. And we have this idea that liberals are like leftists, right? And that they're all centrists. And that's what happens when you have just 2 parties. Like, we're never going to have a third major party, because why would these 2 parties want to split that 50-50 shot, right? And for me, it's not a coincidence that we also have any advanced nation the deepest level of poverty. And it's because we...
Wait a minute, Pat wants to...
the words that kept going through my mind with this, and thank you so much, John, for all of this. This is really awesome. And you took us right to the heart of the matter, which is one of the words, the heart of the matter for me, vision for me. It is so clearly important in my life right now, and the way I see it, of the people around me, that we do not allow the economics, the political, and all of the left brain stuff to be so heavy, which it is right now, that it squashes, it kills vision and matters of the heart. But for me, right now, this is what matters for me personally, and that we need to do. Fight for that part. Not fight each other with Democrat and Republican kind of thing, and not fight on the surface. Houston Smith was a religious historian, and he studied religions all across the world. And he said that we can never understand another person's religion until we go more deeply into our own. And that's where I don't know where that vision is, because it's going to take an awful lot of stuff from us to dig deeply into our own hearts and minds and talk about these things, because we were so inundated with everything. Technology itself, which is wonderful in one way, is very harmful in another, because it's so fast and heavy and into my life, let's say, encroachment. But we have to fight for it. We have to fight with matters of the heart, and perhaps seek a new vision. I don't know.
Yeah, Patricia, I agree with you. I think, many of us here would say, again, these issues are not partisan issues. They're deeply ingrained in our culture, in our political system, our economic way of life. One of the reasons that I was drawn to joining the Religious Society of Friends and becoming a member at Flushing Meeting was I felt at that time that Quakers had these amazing testimonies and were witnesses who actually manifested our beliefs into the world, who had a vision for equality and community and peace and all the things that I find very amazing about Quaker history. But as I became more familiar with the membership, especially in my own meeting, it really became clear that we have a lot more. We have a long road ahead as a faith community. I just had a conversation today with another member of Flushing Meeting, because I feel that we have not, as a society, really come to terms with our own contributions to racism and white supremacy. When people visit Flushing Meeting, I give them tours, and we talk about the history of abolitionists and Quaker women joining the suffrage movement and supporting public education, all the great things that we care about. But Flushing Meeting also had slaves. Our endowment comes from the exchange of slaves. And our land is, our meeting house is built on stolen land of the Matinecock Indians. We haven't really dealt with these issues. And if you look at the history of Quakers, only a small minority were actually abolitionists. Many Quakers resisted for decades the idea that slaves were human and should not be traded and treated like property, and that we needed to release those slaves from bondage. And I think that it had, our inability to recognize and acknowledge that history and to move beyond symbolic gestures like land acknowledgements and, we have a Black Lives Matter banner on our meeting house, and these are symbolic gestures that I support, but I think we have to go beyond the symbolism and try and, as a meeting, figure out how do we acknowledge in a deep way the fact that we're on stolen land. How do we provide access to our meeting house and our property to indigenous people who still live in our community? How do we acknowledge the fact that part of our endowment is from the trading of slaves? I had a difficult time during the pandemic when I couldn't get my own congregation to share in our resources to feed people. Because I think people are so afraid that they may lose everything if we do that. And to me, that's not the goal of a spiritual community. I have friends now, Quaker friends, who are leaving because they couldn't get married. No one was supporting their children and the spiritual lives of families at Flushing. I had requested a travel letter, and it was rejected by my own congregation because some people didn't agree with the phrase that I carried the love of the meeting with me. And so I agree with you. We have to really look within, and I think spirituality is probably one of the keys to intervening in the current system of white supremacy and racism. I think we have to really move people deeply within themselves. And I think the first step is acknowledging our own history and finding ways to acknowledge it in meaningful ways. I feel like Quakers maybe too much like regular Americans in that way. We've kind of lost the ability as a separate faith to grapple deeply with these issues.
Yeah. It's well said. And I think that this is where we are being called today, right now. And we have the opportunity. There is a crashing and breaking that has happened in everywhere, through the pandemic, Trump, the whole thing. It's very huge, but there is space where hardly any of us know where the heck we're going, any time, what to do, how to do it. We've got so many difficulties. But now is a good time, is a wonderful time for us to be asking the questions you just talked about, because it's hugely important. I believe I've been through lots of ministerial things, in the course of my life, and been on the front lines with people. So I've seen too a lot of this and experienced it. But right now, this time calls for me, it calls for new vision. And I don't mean vision, a brand new painting. I'm talking about a new turnaround and asking ourselves, just as you said, to own what we are as human beings, both good and bad, inside each of us, and stand together to work it out in our meetings.
I'm new to Quakerism, and I mean, I'm kind of not shocked, but I'm a little surprised to hear that that other meetings aren't more like ours. I'm guessing this is pretty widespread in America. One of the first things I learned about Quakerism is you can ask 100 Quakers what Quakerism is to them, and you're going to get 100 different answers. And that's kind of the beauty of why I want to be a part of this. So that presents a challenge, like for not so much a challenge, but there may not be all the same commonalities, but we have clearly many commonalities through us. And I always thought one of those was, advocating for the disenfranchised. I thought that was something that went back to Fox and very long ago, but it seems like maybe in some parts, in some meetings, that this has changed.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I have members in my meeting in Flushing who feel it's more important to hold on to our endowments than to address community needs. Anytime I bring up an idea or proposal to help the community, I'm immediately shut down by people who feel like we need to be fiscally responsible. And I don't see the point of amassing wealth and not using it for our community. I have members who, in worship, try and justify the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the continued occupation of Korean people by the U.S. military. And when I try and sit down with those members and explain how deeply hurt I am as an Asian American, as a Quaker, they don't get it. And it deeply troubles me that I feel we've really, at least in my meeting, lost our way and have really strayed from the tradition of Quaker testimonies, which to me it's incredibly powerful if you explain to people who are not Quakers, as I was many years ago.
I wonder if you can come back in a few months and tell us what's going on, and maybe we have homework to do. Maybe Pat can lead us with that. Pat's worship and ministry, and she's our spiritual leader here.
Yeah, I would love to get your guidance. It's hard in our meeting because our meeting is so small. We barely have half a dozen people come to worship with us. Sometimes I have to go outside of my meeting to get any kind of clearness.
Mm-hmm. It looks like we've pretty much covered the topic for this evening. I think the idea of revisiting it in a few months is a good one.